UC Master Gardener webinar on racial equity in the garden. And today we're taking a few minutes to explore resources on UC ANR hosted sites that are providing ideas and concepts and training around racial equity or that which impacts racial equity. So we're going to start with our very own Master Gardener Coordinator website. This should look very familiar to folks, but if you haven't seen it, we have a new page that's up on the Master Gardener Coordinator website. So normally you come to the yellow bar, you navigate through and select a tab that's appropriate for what you're looking for. If you're looking for racial equity resources, you're going to hover over training, and in the drop-down menu, you're going to select racial equity resources. So while this page is not available to volunteers, except those volunteers that have been designated as leaders by their county director within their community, and this is typically in a county that doesn't have UC ANR personnel that are guiding the program, you will be able to, as a coordinator, download or copy and paste these resources to share with volunteers. So the resources fall into a couple of different categories. Some of them you've already seen. As you know, we worked hard to make sure that the Managing Implicit Bias series put out by UCOP, or the University of California Office of the President, was available for free to volunteers or unpaid UC ANR personnel, in addition to paid UC ANR personnel. So we have a reminder there. If you, as an ANR employee, would like to take the training, we recommend going through the MLS website, on the Learning and Development website for UC ANR, because you can get a certificate as a result of that, and it will track your professional development so that you can remember, oh, that's been a while since I took that. Maybe I need a refresher. You can also find a free YouTube series on the UCLA Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. So back to Randy's question, while we're using DEI, this office is using EDI, and they spell everything out, because you're right, sometimes an acronym can be a barrier to understanding or inclusion. And so I really like that the folks at UCLA are spelling out equity, diversity, and inclusion. They have an implicit bias YouTube series that is free and available to the public. And they're 3 minutes long. You could play one at the top of each meeting of a UC Master Gardener project team or committee. And by halfway through the year, you've all had a chance to absorb this content and maybe talk through it. We also have a couple of trainings that are on the e-extension platform, one on cultural competency that's created by our colleagues in extension systems elsewhere in the United States, and a civil rights training from North Carolina. These trainings, some of them are, and I mentioned this above, they're a little bit more focused on compliance. So thinking about what are the rules within an organization. But we also want to be diving a little bit deeper and going beyond compliance into excellence when it comes to racial equity and equity and inclusion in general. Then I've shared some presentations that I think are really useful. They all come from the UC system, one from Sylvia Hurtado on campus climate. So sometimes what we're talking about is those unspoken norms and values inside of an organization that can actually inhibit belonging and inclusion. So I really like her presentation and the way that Dr. Hurtado is talking about this. Then we have some presentations from folks at UC Berkeley and the Othering and Belonging Institute. And the Rise Up for Justice, Black Lives and Our Collective Future, is a recent roundtable that was put together following George Floyd's murder and some of the social movement that coalesced since that time. So I find that to be super helpful. And then another very current presentation is from Nancy Krieger, thinking about public health and COVID-19 and structural racism. Michigan State University, we read the statement on racial equity in preparation for this meeting. They have a bunch of great webinars thinking about racial equity and land-grant institutions specifically. So I just find their work really helpful, and I attend their webinars whenever they're posted. So I encourage folks to do that as well. And I'd be happy to be a thought partner in, how do we implement some of these recommendations, or how do we do more learning? So just love Michigan State University Center for Regional Food Systems. Then we have some readings. Some of them should look familiar because they were pre-readings from today. I also want to shout out some 4-H academics, Faye Moncloa and Liliana Vega, are hosting, and I think a few other folks have been added. I'm thinking Dorina Espinosa and Catherine Soul have been added as facilitators for this group. Reading White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism by Robin DiAngelo. If you, that group is full, but if you want to read along in solidarity, it's a really interesting read. Finally, appreciation to Elaine. The curriculum, the 21-day Racial Equity Habit Building Challenge, is something that Elaine and others brought to the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Alliance at UC ANR, and some folks self-identified as wanting to do some exploration for 21 days around racial equity. And this was put together by Food Systems New England. So again, that food and eating lens, which is really helpful to me as a person who works in a program that's thinking about food in addition to learning environments that are in the outdoors. All of those resources are up on the website, and there's a guidance document, a blog post for how to use this site year round. So if you're inspired to convene a group of volunteers, or if volunteers are excited to convene that group, it might be something to think about. And then finally, we're closing with some vocabulary. So if you're wondering where the vocabulary came from today, it's a little bit of a mix and match, primarily racial equity tools glossary, but we also have some great glossaries that come to us from the UC system. So I recommend checking those out as well. The very last link on the page is to the UC ANR, newly published UC ANR diversity page. Yeah, it looks like, oh, thank you, Elaine, for dropping that in the chat. And Missy mentions JEDI too, which includes, it's an acronym that includes justice in addition to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So this is the ANR page on diversity that was recently built. And maybe I can invite Elaine, if you want to say a few words about it, because I know that you contributed to some of the resources in the colleague recommended piece. Should I open that up?
Yes, please. So the page that Marissa's showing, I dropped that link into the chat. This list that she's showing now comes to us from the UC Office of the President. So they reached out to their employees and sort of crowdsourced resources from a number of different publications, from a number of different authors. So it really is peer-generated compilations addressing race and racial equity issues. It's currently grouped by type of resource, so to speak. So if you are more apt to sit and read something, reflect on it, journal about it, there are a number of articles that vary in length at the top, and then there are also various books. So if you're looking for something longer read, or as Marissa mentioned, if you're looking to engage in a book club or continued dialogue around something, there are a number of book titles that are shared as well. There are some generated lists of other compilations for resources for anti-racism, as well as curated, similar curated lists like we're sharing here, again, from a number of different authors. And then there are videos, films, and podcasts that are listed at the bottom. As Marissa mentioned, Stephanie Pereira and I worked with Strategic Communications to pull this list to make it available for ANR employees, and this is also a public-facing website, so everybody should be able to access it. There was another list that was shared, but we felt that the diversity of voices represented within this list was especially important in this moment to share perspectives and experiences that are widely varied, because that does speak to the diversity that and the personal experiences within this movement and within this work. And so this is there's a lot on this page. It's definitely a starting point, and it is a living document. A number of different resources will continue to be added to some extent. And then the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Alliance is also working on some guidelines for assessing resources on your own. So as you are diving in and digging into this material, if there are other things that you come across, we're hoping to put together some guidelines on how to think critically about that particular source, that particular perspective, to make sure that there is a broad range of voices that are represented, so we can have a better picture, a better, more full picture of what's happening within this work.
Thank you, Elaine. And to bring us to a close, I've just dropped the last link. This is on, I include this because this is another public-facing website. It's the UC ANR Learning and Development website, which has a couple of items on diversity, equity, and inclusion. However, I will emphasize that I think the list that Elaine just talked through and that she and Stephanie curated is more robust, and there's a little bit more more detail and different methods for different learners to engage. So if you are an audio person, no one's commuting right now, but if you're an audio person, or if you're a visual person, or like to take in information in that way, that will be available to you. But I want to show everything that's up on our various websites that touches on this topic, or places that you can watch for future contributions. So with that, we can go ahead and stop recording. Lauren, if you wouldn't mind pressing pause on that record.